Good evening, everyone. Welcome. The Costume Society of America thanks you for joining our Conversations on Dress web panel series that serves as a place to discuss issues in dress studies that promote ideas around diversity. You can find the other installments of the series on our website and YouTube on various topics around diversity. I'm delighted to welcome you and be your host today. My name is Jenny Lee Dupuy, and I am a PhD candidate at Cornell University, where I focus on apparel design. I'm a volunteer with the CSA Conversations on Dress series on this track. The topic for this panel is diversity and inclusivity within studies of dress, and is centered on Black liberation in the fashion discipline and industry. Tonight, our panelists will reflect on this area from a variety of perspectives, backgrounds, and identities, discuss opportunities and barriers in their work, and muse on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the future of fashion. CSA's goal is to discuss some of the issues and examine some examples of good practices within our field. Without further ado, let's welcome our moderator for today. Christian Hogans is a second-year PhD student at the University of Georgia, where her research focuses on redefining, reimagining, deconstructing, and revitalizing fashion merchandising education. Her justice-centered research explores the value and contribution of members of historically marginalized groups who contribute to the fashion discipline. She will introduce today's presenters.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you and welcome everyone in the audience for joining our panel in our monthly installment of the CSA web panels aimed to explore and enhance topics revolving around diversity and inclusivity in dress studies. Professor Holly Price Alford is the Interim Director of Inclusion and Equity for the VCU School of the Arts and is an Associate Professor in the Department of Fashion Design and Merchandising. She holds degrees in both fashion design and in costume design and is widely published. Holly's research emphasis is on how minoritized cultures influence fashion globally, as well as 20th and 21st century fashion icons. Dr. Cheray M Mack completed her PhD in African American and African Studies at Michigan State University in May of 2015, coupled with a graduate certification in urban education. She is part of Cleveland State University's Black Studies program and provides integrative consulting services in the areas of critical approaches to youth engagement, community engagement, and community branding, specifically in under-resourced communities through her consulting firm, Dr. Rae Associates Limited. Diese Matthews is currently a PhD student at Cornell University within the Department of Fiber Science and Apparel Design. She earned her MS in Apparel Merchandising and Design from Iowa State University, where her thesis research examined how Black women use dress as an embodied practice to negotiate both their Black and activist identities as students attending PWIs in Iowa. The project was also curated into a fashion museum exhibition titled Collegiate Fashion and Activism: Black Women's Styles on the College Campus. Taniqua Russ is a fashion historian, researcher, and host of the Black Fashion History podcast, and she holds a master's degree in communications from Rutgers University. The underlying themes of her work highlight the experiences of Black people, celebrate the accomplishments of Black professionals in the fashion industry, educate communities, and provide much-needed representation. Her work celebrating the unsung Black heroes of fashion and expertise in Black fashion culture has been highlighted in various publications such as Vogue and Refinery 29 UK. Thank you all for joining me tonight. I'm so excited to see you all, and I'm so excited to start this conversation. So I will jump right into the questions. Our first question is going to be for the entire panel, and I will be asking you all to define liberation and how you envision it within the fashion discipline. What is imperative for the manifestation of this type of liberation?
Liberation, freedom, equity, inclusion. That's liberation.
I would echo the same thing. The main focus, though, is allowing us the opportunity to tell our own stories. I think we can't truly have Black liberation in this industry if we're not controlling our narrative. So, tack on being the storytellers and having agency over our work and our creations.
Hi, everyone. Liberation to me simply means not one population of us is free until we're all free. So we have to say their names, say her name, Ma'Khia Bryant, say his name, Dante Wright, and on and on.
Absolutely. And just echoing off of all of my fellow panelists, definitely just embodying oneself, especially through fashion, and really unapologetically expressing whatever that is through your fashion, I think is what liberation is. And in order to manifest it, we have to prioritize it, I would say. Prioritizing Black stories, and then prioritizing the accessibility and the ability to express that identity through fashion.
I definitely agree with all of those sentiments. Definitely freedom, which is why liberation was the theme of this panel, and definitely us having space to be able to tell our stories is something that's really important to me as far as what liberation looks like in the discipline. So I thank you for that. Our next question is also for all of our panelists, and it is, how important is it for fashion scholars to be aware and reflective of their identities? Based on your current projects or your work, how have your identities been integrated into your scholarship?
I think personally that it is very critical for scholars to be reflective of their own identities. And I think because there are a lot of reasons why, but just being aware can really impact your work. So my personal experience being a Black woman and then doing a master's thesis that highlighted Black women through with their use of fashion, I had to really reflect on my own experiences when trying to somewhat understand the women who I was interviewing, while also, not meshing my experiences with theirs, allowing them to have their own separate experience. But it was still really important for me to consider how I used fashion at predominantly white institutions.
Our identities are really the framework or the perspective in which we approach our work, and we share our work with the world. And in order to get a diverse collection of Black stories, as we all aim to do, it is important that each of us is feeding our identities into our work. And then, as Dai said, but also making sure that, we aren't crossing our experience with the experience of the people that we're talking to. So like on this panel, we're all Black women, and while we may all be Black women, all of our experiences are different. And it's important that each of those individual stories are shared in its truest form. So respecting each of our stories, but also understanding that, there's a commonality. So I think it's a line, but a very delicate line, but one that's beautiful if it's done correctly.
I mean, I agree with the panelist. I think it's extremely important, especially if it's underrepresented, if your identity is underrepresented within this industry and within the fashion industry, it definitely is underrepresented. And I think that our stories need to be told, and that our perspectives needs to be told, particularly considering, especially when we're dealing with fashion and style, our cultural, when you're seeing your cultural style and fashion being emulated, and there's no representation of your identity within that, yes, there's no ifs, ands, or buts. You need to place your identity within your perspectives, and you need to let the world know who you are, what our cultural background entails, and why this is important.
So Taniqua, I would like to start with you for this question. What are the best practices in storytelling in your work, and what other scholars do you follow that are telling stories of Black people within our industry?
I would say the main best practice that I put into place is really something that we literally just discussed, is making sure that I'm not inserting myself into the stories that I share. So on my podcast, my goal is to share the contributions of Black people to the fashion industry, and that largely includes interviewing people who have worked in the industry for decades and having them share their experience and document their stories that we may not have known otherwise. A lot of them have come up in a different time with a different experience in the fashion industry. Some of it's similar, some of it isn't. So allowing them the space to truly express themselves so they can be able to document their story in its truest form is really the best way, I think, to make sure that our voices are heard in all aspects of it. And some of the people that I follow that are also doing some of the same work, and again, staying true to our stories and sharing them in its variety of forms. You know, I would say number one is Kimberly Jenkins. She is the creator of the Fashion and Race Database. And that's a great resource that continuously is looking at and critiquing the work of race, in fashion, but also sharing the stories of people of color, Black people specifically, but also other groups of color and other marginalized groups. Dr. Jonathan Square is another one. Dr. Tanisha Ford is another one that I typically look to when I am trying to see how to better my footprint in this industry and continue the work that we're doing.
Do any of our other panelists have any scholars that they follow that has impacted their work in any way?
Sure. So I actually, my PhD is in African American Studies, African American and African Studies, and as well as I have a graduate certificate in urban education. So my intersection with Black Studies and my intersection with fashion is unique in many ways. My dissertation research and continuing research is on how Black youth in urban schools use fashion and style as one way of communicating their multiple identities. And so the researchers that I leaned upon heavily and still do are more in the urban ed field, but definitely speak to how our institutions, how our schools, how our districts should be more culturally sustaining and culturally relevant. And those top two scholars are definitely Gloria Ladson-Billings and Django Paris.
Sure, and I can definitely agree with Taniqua in that Dr. Ford's work has really impacted my research and just trying to continue the work that she does. And I also think of the well-known Kimberly Crenshaw, who, introduced us all to intersectionality, which is really prevalent in our work as Black women, as we have to look at that intersection all of the time, as well as other identities.
So I will circle back to Dr. Rae, and I will have you start this question in sharing how important it is to have the inclusion of community in your work.
Thank you so much, Christian. In a nutshell, just to speak on that very briefly, I believe I can humbly speak for all of the panelists here. We had a chance to meet on Monday in advance, and we're not approaching this conversation in any way, shape, or form to say that identity is singular. As Dais just mentioned, we're all pretty well versed in intersectionality and know that we're bringing multiple identities to our work and to the work that we do and to this conversation. So be encouraged. It's going to get there. We just started. All right. So in terms of community, in short, again, every piece of research that I've done and even the work that I do in teaching Intro to Black Studies as visiting campus and community lecturer at Cleveland State, I always bring the community arm into it, right? So in Black Studies, we say academic excellence and social responsibility. So if you are a true Black Studies scholar, our work equally has to be a part of what we're going to do in our neighborhoods, in our communities to uplift the culture, uplift our people first and foremost, and then lift others as we climb, right? And so in part, one piece of that fashion-wise that connects, like physical fashion-wise. I have a brand called My Hood is for My Hood. And that simply is a brand that uplifts the idea that whatever we do in any lane that we are in, like if you're the top basket weaver in the nation, right? Some piece of that work, though may be small, should be siphoned, should be channeled back into whatever community that you come from. All right. And it's incredibly valuable, incredibly necessary for the Black community to have a conduit, a layer of one's work, whatever that work may be, back into the culture, especially at a time like this, especially when we're in the midst of the resurgence of Black Lives Matter and the movement for liberation of Black lives. We don't have time to not find something that we're passionate about and something that can reach our community at a time like this.
Would any of our other panelists like to add on the inclusion of community in your work and why that is important?
I just want to say I agree with Dr. Rae, and especially something she said earlier when we all, I guess, first got on the panel, which is, we're not free until we all are free. And I think that is displayed, like, definitely in community. So one of us can get to a point where we feel like we've personally experienced liberation, quote unquote, in our industries or whatever. But if that has not trickled down back to where we've come from or into our community as a whole, what does that really mean? Is that true liberation? And so I think it's important that we don't get comfortable where we are. And again, there should be some aspect of us always channeling that into our community. And I think community, or our communities, are really what makes our work. Specifically talking about fashion, everything that has come up from, trend wise, that has been like extracted from Black culture, has come from Black communities and Black cities around America and around the world. So it's what makes us who we are. And in order for us to continue this work and this journey of liberation, we need to stay connected with our communities and work to bring us to a place where we can all experience equity and freedom.
I mean, it has gotten to a point where, so I'm a practicing designer, went into the industry in 1991, and I thought I would never, ever see the Council of Fashion Designers now has a Black Fashion Council made up of top Black designers who are now getting together to develop strategies on how we maintain a non-racist industry that is appreciative of Black culture and Black style. So we are getting together as a community to ensure that our voices are heard throughout our industry.
Also, to add to that, I think about how in academia it's really easy to become in a bubble. Like we're doing our research and then we publish it, but you have to be attending a school that subscribes to the journal to read the article. There's some type of paywall that is often preventing our own communities from accessing this information. So I think about that often, like I'm doing work, yes, to uplift my community, but at the same time, arguably most of them are not able to read it or really know how the system, how academia even works. So I think it's really important for us to have podcasts that are easily accessible, right? Or creating some type of online database as the Fashion Race database, or just something that's easily accessible to most people in the community, because again, that's how we can really invoke change.
Thank you. Dais, that's an awesome segue into our next question that I'm going to have you start with, because we're going to talk about access. So I want to know some of your personal challenges that you've had to face when accessing materials. This can be archival or literature on Black people in fashion. And what are some of your creative alternative methods or solutions to accessing these resources?
Yeah, one that comes to mind is I am very passionate about a topic, that I want to explore for my dissertation. And it includes a woman named Lois Alexander Lane, who in the 1950s and 60s established the Black Fashion Museum and the Harlem Institute of Fashion. And her entire collection and archive is currently at the Smithsonian. And as everyone has been impacted by COVID-19, I don't have access to the archive, and there's no telling when that will happen. So I've been in contact with the head curator. They're going to keep me posted. But again, access is kind of limited, as it is for a lot of different archives. But I think in addition to that, specifically, it's at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And just speaking with colleagues, I think that it's somewhat apparent that funding is also short in a lot of different ways. So I think when it comes to preserving our history, sometimes we're the last straw to get the funding that's needed to have these archives, processed and accessible to the public. And that's definitely a barrier, because here's little old me wanting to do the research, but not having access to it. But on the flip side, I do have a colleague at Case Western who's doing some work on the National Association of Fashion and Accessories and Designers, I believe, is the organization that was by Black people. And I reached out to her, and she did give me a bit of information and archival stuff that she had, because the woman that I'm referring to was actually a part of that organization. So just making connections with folks who are doing similar research or may have an idea of how to access in a different way. But in general, we do need more funding at these institutions that house our histories, because researchers want to do the work and to get the information out there, but I think there are barriers.
I would also say that in addition to lack of funding sometimes, there also hasn't been, depending on the subject area, a great work done in documenting our history. I know that's one of the challenges that I've come, across when I've been doing my podcast or trying to share some research, is that there may be a person or a topic that wasn't researched enough or documented during their time, so we don't have that information. And so that's why I always encourage people, especially those working in the industry right now, is to document your story, through photos, save all of the information that you have on yourself or your colleagues, because years from now, that's the information that we're going to be looking at to say, we existed, we were here, this is what we did. And that has been a challenge when it comes to accessing information. And I think one way that we can do better with that in the present is, like I said, to tell our own stories, document it, and then also, like Dais mentioned, make connections with colleagues, because they may have access to things that we do not have access to, and kind of just continue to put those things together so that the people who want to do the work have the tools that they need to do the work and continue to expand in this area.
I want to add to that as well. A lot of times also, and I totally agree, trying to find the work is very difficult because a lot of the work has not been documented. And one of the things that I did come to the realization also is that sometimes you find it in areas that you never thought you would go into. I did a lot of historical research on slave designers, and did not know that I ended up finding more information at the Museum of the Confederacy than I did in other places. And that's one place I would have never walked into. And so be open-minded in terms of where that research might be as well. So just a note about that. But it is very difficult. A lot of our historical research is not documented or not discussed or talked about. And sometimes it's in areas where, I was doing research on topsy-turvy dolls and found it at the Daughters of the American Revolution Museum. And so sometimes that research is in areas that we never expected.
So, Dr. Price, I am going to start this next question with you because we've been talking about storytelling and our stories being missing and not really having as much access to the materials that we do need for our research. So what are some of the perspectives that are missing in our discipline in academic writing? And this can be brief because I'm sure there are multiple perspectives that are missing. And what are some potential barriers that we may experience in publishing this content? And also, this is a very loaded question. So I do want you to also bring into the conversation how those missing perspectives are valuable to the discipline.
Yeah, it is a loaded question. Majority of our research is missing. Okay, so historical research, kudos to those who have podcasts, who are doing historical podcasts, because websites. I know there's a website called Edge who's doing Afro Edge or Afro something like that, which is actually telling historical stories about fashion. But it's not being told, it's not being researched. I mean, I'm glad everybody found out about Elizabeth Keckley and Ann Lowe, but there's also, Fanny Chris and Zelda Wynn and so many others that need to be researched. There's also not enough research on what's happening in the industry right now. We are having a moment, again, it happened 10 years ago. Now it's happening, it happened 5 years ago. Now it's happening again, where we are looking at the industry and trying to figure out what's going on in the industry and why is the industry so racist. And so there's not research on that. We have several companies who've made several bold statements. Where's the research and the data, okay, to hold those companies, corporations, okay, and conglomerates accountable? If you're going to have VPs by 2026, we just had PVH say that if you're going to have Black directors and VPs, where's that data to hold them accountable to that? So there's just a slew of things that are not being researched or thought about. Menswear is about to change. If you didn't know, the streetwear luxury industry used to be a fringe in menswear. It's no longer. It is menswear. They are trying to hire all of the luxury streetwear designers in these luxury brands. We've already seen Virgil Abloh and Louis Vuitton. So I'm just saying, and Jerry Lorenzo is about to start this American brand. I'm just saying that, where is this research happening? And I don't see it, and I would love to see it. In terms of publishing, yeah, sometimes you deal with the same issues with the publishing company that we're dealing with the industry. Yes, some publishing companies can be racist and ignorant. A lot of publishing companies, and several people on this podcast know, sometimes they're ignorant of our field, about the field. So they'll actually give you the contract and whatnot, but then they don't understand fashion or dress or historical dress. And so they'll try to take things out, and you're trying to put things back in, and you're having these conversations back and forth. I will say that a lot of the publications that I received were overseas. So I always made sure that when there was a chance to present a paper for a conference, I always did an overseas conference. I always did one in England, because at the time when I was when I was really doing a lot of research, I had started in the late 90s and early 2000s. There weren't a lot of publications here, like the Journal of Popular Culture and Fashion and things like that. There weren't those journals here in the U.S. So a lot of my publications came from me going to conferences and being invited, my papers being invited in journals or being invited to publish and whatnot. The prospectus is important. It is. So just to give you an example, I remember a while ago, I was in Las Vegas at a CSA conference in Vegas, and I had been doing a lot of research on the zoot suit. And I remember someone had written a book, and she was presenting. And she had actually gone through the archives to find zoot suits, and she could not understand why some of the zoot suits did not look like zoot suits. And somebody at CSA stood up and said, Holly's been doing research on this and da-da-da. And I said, I'm here. And I said, what states are they coming from? And she was giving me the states. And I said, I need you to think about the time period. I said, my grandfather had a powder blue zoot suit. I said, but it didn't look like a zoot suit because he didn't want to bring attention to himself, and he didn't want to get lynched during that time. And she said, oh my gosh. And I said, so his jacket was about 2 inches bigger, a little bit more fullness. I said, but you're not going to see a full zoot suit from certain states in the United States where lynching is highly prevalent. And she was like, well, thank you so much, da 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 da. And at that moment, I was like, oh, that's great. I gave her not only a historical, but cultural perspective that was important to her research so that she would understand. So that's why our perspective is important. I also want to comment that a lot of times when we talk about our perspectives, particularly in the United States, it's an American historical perspective. It's not only a Black perspective, but it's an American perspective.
So I know that, in academic writing, we have to provide some type of framework around the work that we're doing. And I want to start this question with Dr. Mack. In what ways have you used existing theory to build your contextual knowledge around Black people in the institution of fashion?
Absolutely. I think that's a great question, Christian. Honestly, one of the most influential frameworks, speaking back to the earlier question in the chat, excuse any rising scholars that might be in the background. One of my leading frameworks that I rely on heavily is critical race theory, specifically critical race theory in education. And within that framework, we have intersectionality, as Jais mentioned, that was birthed by Kimberly Crenshaw, leading legal scholar, leading activist in more ways than one. I lean on that heavily in my work and in my teaching practice, because we do all bring multiple identities to not only the work that we do, but just how we exist in the world and how the world responds to us. And we think about fashion, right? So a lot of times people try to drown our field out or say that it's surface in some ways. But ultimately, I developed a concept, a framework called critical fashion literacy, which simply says that we're reading and writing how we look and how we feel on a daily basis, and what we put on our bodies is being read, and written on by those who are viewing us. And especially for young people who are developing their identities and making space for who they are in this world, those multiple identities are written every single day by what they choose to put on their bodies, and how the world is in turn viewing them, whether in a positive or negative light, but how they're being read.
Are any of our other panelists, have you used any other theories outside of critical race theory or intersectionality in your work to frame your projects?
So no, not yet. I've only done kind of one really large scale, I guess, study for my master's, but I did exactly use critical race theory and intersectionality. I did also use a bit of Black feminist thought, but I think, critical race theory and intersectionality are prevalent in our work, clearly, because they really speak to those issues of power and race and how we can deconstruct those systems.
So, Dais, I will start with you on this question. What are the modes in which liberation may be modeled in your museuming? And what specific practices have you incorporated or have witnessed? And if you have any examples, please share those.
Sure. So with my master's thesis, I curated an exhibition that was encompassed of garments and accessories that Black women loaned to me that represented their Blackness and or activism. I had about 40 garments and accessories in total, and the exhibition took place on my campus at that time. So my advisor and I dressed all of the mannequins. We set up the whole exhibition. And we also had large scale 36 by 48 images of the women who participated in the study. And we had those up throughout the gallery. And the purpose of that was to combat this notion that oftentimes when you're walking on campuses, you see large scale images of white men. So we wanted to create a space for Black women to be viewed. So we had these large images throughout the entire gallery, and we had the mannequins dressed. However, the mannequins are made of white fabric, which most museum folks know, right? Mannequins are sometimes all white or most of the time made of all white fabric. And one of the themes within the exhibit was pride and skin tone. And the women were telling me that they often wear bright colors in their clothing to wear against their skin to kind of make their skin pop, because they were proud of that, proud of their darker skin tones. So we had this really beautiful red dress that was within that theme, and it was dressed on a white mannequin, and it took away the story in a lot of ways. So my advisor and I unlocked all of the cases. We undressed everything. We then went to Joann's. Our colleague went to Joann's and found different shades of brown fabric to display different tint tones. And then we cut this fabric and stretched it and pinned it and folded it to make all of these custom covers. And then we redressed everything and put it back. So we had to take on additional labor, right? Because we had the mannequins are white. Like, we can't really do anything about that in the moment. We had to think and come up with a plan, but it's representative of how arguably white supremacy is embedded within these systems, specifically within museum practices. So that was something that we had to combat, and it also helped us realize that how are we wanting to represent people of color in the museum space, however we have stark white mannequins. It just doesn't really work. Especially when you have people saying that they're proud in their skin tone and they want to show that through their dress. How do we represent that on a white mannequin? So that's my experience that I've had.
Thank you. And then that brought forth another issue that we have in our industry as far as exclusion and diversity in the design process and in design education. Like, what are the mannequins looking like that our students are designing on? And how does that impact their creative processes in the classroom and further their creative practices when they go into the industry? So there's this connection between the classroom and the industry, and the industry is the pattern from from the pattern from which our education is being sown, and vice versa. So I thank you for that answer. I do want to ask all of our panelists, what are some film and theater projects that are relevant to our discipline that have done well in telling and modeling the stories of Black liberation? And what are some examples that you may share that you've liked?
I think this is a great question, Christian. The two that immediately came to mind, just coming off the cuff here, Dr. Rae style. To take it back, throwback wise, The Wiz was costume at its finest, right? Multiple layers of Black identity, multiple layers of Black pop culture, multiple layers of music culture, Black music culture, and then boom, this eruption. I mean, I don't know who the costume designer was for that or who coordinated that whole work, but honey,
You gotta be seeing green. I love that film.
Right with the culture. And then to fast forward, my second example would be Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, right? Again, just and rest in peace, Chadwick Boseman, just ripe and so about what it means to be in the culture, of the culture, for the culture. Just a robust work that took a lot of time, like The Wiz did, and so those would be my two that I lean on.
Okay, well, I'm gonna do a throwback too. Mahogany for me. To me, it was just, this is Black beauty at its finest. The costumes, of course, amazing. But just the fact that, oh my goodness, I mean, it's one of the movies that is the reason why I wanted to go into fashion when I saw it. Fast forward, this might seem kind of weird, but I love the fact that Black is equal in Bridgerton, that there is not supposed to be, you're not supposed to look at the character's color. It's more about class. Like, what would have happened if Queen Charlotte, has, these kids and no one looks at that? I thought that was interesting. I thought that was an amazing way of looking at equality in a very unique way, to Shonda Rhimes. But yeah, I thought that was interesting, and the costumes are woo.
My example is the TV show Girlfriends. So it's one of, I guess, the earliest examples on network television of Black women in luxury, which is something that we don't get to see a lot of. And I think the costume designer on that is a Black woman. And so it was our opportunity to really see different kinds of Black women and their expressions of themselves through dress, but also see them in things that, we are not supposed to have, and experience the luxuries of living in LA, which is not something that, we saw. Like, we were getting the Sex and the City images where you have a cast of white friends, those kinds of things, or our images of Black people were them being in the hood or very urban or hip hop related dress, and Girlfriends gave us something else. And I think it was just another example that Blackness is not just one form. Like, we come in all shapes, sizes, experiences. And so that was a great thing to see on television. And I'll also add that a lot of the music videos nowadays are doing a great job, in my opinion, of showing dress and expressing Blackness through dress. Even though this is a really long music video, but Beyonce's Black is King, that was a great example of that. And then a lot of the newer artists are bringing in, more Black costume designers or more Black stylists, more Black designers and their clothing choices to really just express, their Blackness, or they're throwing it back to, their favorite 90s or early 2000 trends, where Black people really kind of shined artistically in our expression of ourselves.
Yeah, to second that for sure. Thinking about the Cardi B and Bruno Mars video where they wore cross colors and it was all 90s thing. That was super fun to see, just because of the impact that brands like Cross Color had on the Black community. Also shout out to Ruby Carter, who's the queen of costume design. But I would second Professor Price in saying that Bridgerton is crazy, primarily because Shonda Rhimes, it's her vision, right? So the cast looks a certain way, the topic is what it is, but that's Shonda Rhimes' mind on a screen. And the costumes are absolutely amazing. I'm sure she has the costume designer on set, but that costume designer, I assume, would report to Shonda Rhimes. So I think Bridgerton is a great example.
Thank you. So, Dr. Price, I'm going to start with you on this next question. How might fashion students and professionals be trained on and better educated about diverse, inclusive, equitable, and just practices in the curriculum and industry initiatives? And can you possibly identify any areas that may need some improvement in current DEI and justice practices in fashion education or the industry?
Okay, so that's kind of loaded, so I'm going to try to...
I gave you all the long questions.
I know. I'm going to try to give you sort of a summary in terms of academia and in terms of industry. The first thing that needs to happen is both academia and industry need to have statements. They need to have inclusive statements, and part of those statements have to have an anti-racism statement within them. Then they need to make sure that they have DEI officers who have strategic plans that have goals set that include educational programs, because this is how our faculty, staff, and students and industry professionals are going to have to learn about their biases, their microaggressions, their understanding race, etc. There has to be accountability placed within both institutions as well, and there has to be some type of learning centers and safe spaces for people to come to be able to find out, okay, how do I ensure that my curriculum is diverse, and how do I write that curriculum, and as well as safe spaces for there to be conversations without retribution around what is happening in the workplace and what is going on in the industry. That's how I can only sum it up because there's a lot. Gaps that are happening. I think that sometimes, especially I'm a fashion designer, and I know that when I talk to faculty, sometimes they'll say, well, I don't need to have an inclusive curriculum because I teach construction. And I always say, you have human beings in your class. So you have to ensure that you have an inclusive curriculum, and you need to make sure that you're making statements that aren't racist, derogatory, sexist, etc. And in terms of the industry, whew, Lord have mercy, gap. There is no one of color in VP or director positions within conglomerates. LVMH, Kering, PVH, OTB, even Condé Nast. If there's one Black woman in Condé Nast, and guess what she is? The DEI officer. Okay? And we have to do a better job. We have to hold these conglomerates and corporations accountable. Like I said before, PVH, they do Tommy Hilfiger, they do those types of brands. I'm telling you right now, they have said 2026, they will have directors and VPs of color by 2026. I'm holding them accountable to that. Because one of the gaps that we're having in the industry is that when we have a social justice crisis, what ends up happening is they make these bold statements and then they don't do anything about it. And then the other thing that happens is they'll make money, and this happens, they'll make money off of a certain situation or a statement, etc., but not do anything internally in terms of ensuring that there's strategies and things done to ensure inclusivity within the workplace. And that it's a huge gap. You know, I'm not saying that Kanye and LeBron and Michael and all of them didn't make money off of Nike. I'm not saying that, but you're going to tell me that you team up with Black athletes, you team up with Black designers, but your core of Black designers at Nike, not one of them is of color. So things have to change. These are some gaps that we're seeing right now in the industry. And there needs to be strategic planning, strategies, DEI strategies that are put in place in these corporations to ensure inclusivity. And we need to have persons of color at the top. You all saw what happened with Gucci. You all saw what happened with H&M. And they all screamed because nobody of color was at the table to tell them it was racist. And there needs to be that person there and that diversity of thought, of process. I mean, we know diversity drives excellence. Diversity sells. Edward Interval is already showing that. He's showing that. I think he's the only luxury magazine right now that's making money. So yeah, but we have some serious gaps in the industry.
As far as gaps go, I'd also add, I think it's important that, like Professor Price say, we pull in people of color in all areas. I think a lot of times when we have a social justice crisis, these companies like to call Black professionals to speak on Black things and be the diversity person, and you come and talk to us about Blackness and how to be anti-racist and this Black trend or this Black thing. Like, Black people can talk about more than just quote unquote Black things. You know, we're gifted in all areas. There are many Black professionals in the industry that can come on board, you know, and be execs or be VPs and have regular non-diversity positions. And I think it's very important that we start getting some people of color in those positions that don't just have to do with teaching white people how to not be racist. Because we're tired of that, and that's not our job.
So I do want to ask this question before we go to our questions that our audience have dropped in the chat box. What is the most valuable token of advice you may offer to those who are looking to enter the field? And this is for anyone on the panel.
I'll start. I think some of the most valuable advice I can give you is to establish relationships with everyone around you. I think a lot of times what's happening in the industry is, it's like, okay, I'm the designer, so I have a relationship with this designer and that designer and da-da-da. No, I have a relationship with the sample maker. I have a relationship with the garment maker. I have a relationship with everyone. Speaking from an industry standpoint and an academic, it's cutthroat. The person who you can be the boss one day and somebody else can be your boss the next day. And so it is extremely important to develop those relationships. I developed a relationship with the person who was cleaning the floor, and she hooked me up. So we had a wonderful relationship, and she knew a lot. And so my attitude is always develop those relationships and make sure that when you're developing those relationships, you develop them with everyone. You don't just pick and choose who you develop a relationship with.
Mm-hmm.
I'll say always be learning. So be open to, every opportunity to learn, even if things aren't technically your job or your position or what you're even interested in. Be open to learning, because that knowledge can take you to the next step, or it can give you some insight into how to do what you want to do better. And it helps build those relationships. So, always stay learning.
These are so bomb. Anyone who's listening is totally getting some gems and jewels here.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to couple my response with something that I said earlier, and then to echo Professor Price's example about the construction professor, right? Everyone needs to pick a lane, pick something to do that is in the DEI area, diversity, equity, inclusion, and intersectionality. Like to add that extra I in the consulting work I do. Ultimately, when you're coming in, if you're already in the field, we're in a movement, right? And so I like to tell my students, what are your descendants going to, when they read about this time period that we're in, a global pandemic plus Black Lives Matter, right? When they read about this in history books, which they will, because we've read about civil rights, we read about Black power, we read about all these movements. When they read about us as ancestors, when they read about us in the sands of time, what side of justice are you going to be standing on? No matter what field you're in, right? But if you're in this field, as Professor Price mentioned, which is heavily, heavily, heavily in need of DEI, right? If you're in this field, if you're seeking to be in this field, find some way to contribute in that way, right? Make some kernel of your work committed to the quest for social justice and liberation, right? Because if you're not committed to that, your descendants will be reading these books and recognizing that there are folks back in the day weren't on the right side of justice. And that's not a feeling that you want to have wherever you may be in the cosmos. All right.
And to echo Dr. Rae's point about finding your lane in relation to AI, also finding your lane in what you're passionate about. I remember being an undergrad and attending a PWI and really wanting to do research on Black people in fashion, and was often told you should reconsider, because whatever people's reasons were. But I was passionate about it. I felt like it was my lane, and it's gotten me to where I am now. And it's going to continue to take me where I want to go, because it's truly something that I'm passionate about. So I would say, if it's your passion, if you want to uplift Black people through your work, then do it. And don't let folks tell you that you should not.
Yes, thank y'all so much. I want to offer my own token, because I'm also going through my own program and doing my own work. And what's worked for me is definitely being reflective of the purpose of why I'm here. When I'm always aware of my purpose and why I'm doing my work, the intentionality just follows. So that's the work that I'm doing, that's the methods that I choose, stories that I'm reading, all of that follows because I'm always being aware of, okay, this is why we're here. This is the justice work that I want to do. So I'm always looking for what's not being told, and that fuels the work that I'm writing and the work that I'm telling other scholars about. So I also think that that's very important if you're looking to enter the field as well. So I'm going to go into the questions that our audience members have been inputting into the chat box. The first I will ask is from Kelly, and the question is, what was the most meaningful class or non-institutional learning experience you've had throughout your career in relation to fashion, and how has it informed the approaches to your work today?
My most meaningful class was in my master's program in Africana Studies at NYU, and it was with the esteemed Dr. Deborah Willis, who is the chair of photography and imaging. The course was called Black Body in the Lens. And so, in short, we were there to see and discover and learn and be immersed in how the Black body has been viewed over the sands of time, not just photography wise, but in film, in fine art, so on and so forth. And she eventually became one of my mentors. She was my thesis advisor. And the work that I did under her led into my dissertation research as well. So just being in that space and having a moment to, and I went to an HBCU, so I went to Tennessee State. Shout out to my HBCU experience. I've been immersed in Blackness a long time, but to study the Black body at that level, right, the graduate school level, with a leading scholar such as herself, was critical to my development. And she has countless books. One of her main books is one of her top books is Posing Beauty, right? And just really taking a look at how we are represented, how we represent ourselves, and how the world has a gaze upon us. And in short, through her class, I had an opportunity to meet the esteemed photographer Jamel Shabazz, world-renowned Jamel Shabazz, and his top book or breakthrough book was A Time Before Crack, right? So he has photographed hundreds of Black and brown bodies around the world, maybe thousands at this point. But my non-academic experience with him was that I studied photography under him on the streets of New York City, where I lived in Brooklyn, right? And we literally walked around with our cameras and politely asked people, can we shoot them, right? On the streets. And that process of working with him and being humble and communicating with our those who we were doing photography with instead of just shooting, right? Because a lot of people just steal our images. We know that as a fact. But those two were pivotal in where I stand.
I can add briefly to that. I took a course at Iowa State called Black Lives Matter, Fashion Liberation, and the Fight for Freedom, taught by Kelly Reddy Best and co-produced by Brandon Spencer, who was a student at the time. And in that class, we read Dr. Ford's book, Liberated Threads. And that was the book that inspired me to do the work. So definitely that was something that has been influential for me then and then also now.
So for me, it wasn't a class. It was an experience in the industry. I had been at work and went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art to do some research for a class because I had started my classes at FIT after I graduated from the University of Virginia. So for me, New York was this amazing, diverse place. But when you went to work in the industry, it was like, okay, where are the Black people? And I remember I ran into Gianni Versace, one of my idols in the industry. And I remember he actually sat down with me because I introduced myself to him. I, explained how much I loved him. And I said, I'm really interested in this industry. And he was like, well, what's keeping you from it? And I explained, I don't see anyone like me. I said, yes, I know about Tracy Reese, Byron Lars. They were all out in 90, 91, 92. And but he actually sat down with me and said, you know, the industry is lacking. He knew what the industry was lacking. He was encouraging me to go into the industry. He was, you know, it was just amazing. And so I said, oh yeah, he was like, you've got to be the change agent. You're the one that needs to change the world and the industry, and da, da, da. And I was like surprised that this white Italian man was telling me this, but he was. And from that point on, that was it. I was determined to be a designer, and I was extremely successful. And so when I got into the educational field and decided to do my research, I said, oh, I know I'm doing my research. And there was no ifs, ands, or buts.
Our next question is from Kimberly, and they are asking, what career or job positions would the panelists recommend currently for young African Americans who have an interest in fashion?
I would say, you know, whatever you're passionate about, obviously, wherever you're gifted in. But if you're looking for something more specific than that, I would say anything that has to do with luxury fashion management, business management, or like marketing, because as we talked about earlier, we really need more Black people in those VP positions with the business background and the experience in the fashion industry. A lot of times, you know, Black creatives are called on for the creative positions and the stylist and the designer and the things to come in and make the brand seem cool, but we're not in those higher level positions. And so it's very important to have that educational background, have that industry experience in those areas, so that when the time comes, you know, there is a qualified person of color available to be there and run those brands.
I'll echo on what she has just stated, because now don't get me wrong, if you want to be a designer, okay, if you want to be the next top designer, what I've always said is just whatever you're interested in, just get your foot in the door. Just getting your foot, doesn't matter what you do, because if you can't get your foot in the door, it's not going to matter. It's not going to matter. It is easy if you're good to move your way up in the industry. If the problem is that we get stagnant at a certain position, and that is our problem, particularly as designers. And my attitude is get in there. And also, I will concur with you, make sure you have some merchandising experience. If you find out anybody's offering a minoring in merchandising, it is extremely important that you have some type of business background, especially if you want to be a designer, especially if you want to own your own company. And do that. We thank goodness we now have Black designers who own their companies right now. So, and they're taking over their companies. I think Kirby Jean Raymond just bought back his company. Thank goodness. So, Aurora James, 100% of her company, she owns it. She owns it. So
our next question will be from Faith, and they are asking for the panel to comment on the issues of diversity in body image and how that has changed in some aspects, but not at all.
Referring back to my experience with having to cover the mannequins, there's also a paper out by Dr. Green and some of her colleagues about gender representation in mannequins, which is also an issue, right? Because the way that mannequins are currently represented in museum culture and also in the industry, I would argue, unless they're abstract, maybe in some way, is a very binary representation. So that's definitely somewhere where work needs to be done. And I think scholars in our field are telling the industry that through our research, and hopefully change will be made.
and I hate to say this, but right now a lot of brands are recognizing, particularly intimate brands. I mean, kudos to Rihanna and some of the other brands that go from a size 0 to like a 34 wide. including intimates, who are leaving some of the other brands like Victoria's Secret, which is what was happening, and going to these brands that are more accommodating to what we call a real person's figure. And so, and who are doing an excellent job of advertising real bodies so that people can see themselves as we talk as Black women, seeing ourselves in ads, on television, etc. And what that has done is caused a huge shift in some of these brands to recognize that they now need to go into plus size. But it's because there's a realization if they want to make money, they need to too. And I hate to say that, but that is a realization for some of these brands. But kudos, we have a lot of new brands that are coming out, and they are putting their styles on what real women look like, and it's wonderful to see. It really is. It's absolutely wonderful to see.
So I do want to thank all of our audience members for putting some questions into the chat box. And I'm going to ask our last question from our audience. This is from Monica. And the panelists mentioned documenting the now in both design and in current affairs. What items or which designers should be collected now to document this time?
Okay, I'm sorry. I gotta. Jerry Lorenzo, Fear of God. He wants to be the next Ralph Lauren, American design, but tell his story of a Black perspective. Kirby Jean, Raymond, Pierre Moss, Aurora James, Telfair. We need to document Telfair. Oh Lord, Edward Interfol. We need to Samir. We need to. There's so many, and this is extremely important because at this moment in time, we are starting to see an emergence of Black designers, editors who are trying to move their way up and who are creating their own brands and who are making money. And all of these designers are now being asked to be creative directors of other designers, like Virgil Abloh, who's Off-White, but he's creative director for Louis Vuitton and things like that. Jerry just became the global marketing manager for Adidas basketball. So this is what's starting to happen. And if we don't document this, and my fear is that all of these great things are about to go away, but I'm praying that this is a path forward and that we'll continue to see this process in progress. Tracy Reese, somebody needs to document her. Somebody needs to have a full page spread on Tracy Reese. She's been around since 1987, and she's one of the most successful Black female designers out there.
I agree with everything Professor Price said. I'd also add your favorite small independent designers as well. A lot of what I found in my research is that smaller designers, they may get like one line in like a 1960s issue of Ebony, then we never hear about them again. And that's still important history for us to document. So I'd say buy from your favorite small designers. Because you might look up tomorrow and they no longer exist. That's what happened, even though she wasn't a small designer or considered a small designer, but that's what happened to Carly Cushing. Her brand, was here one day and then now it isn't. So it's very important that as we have the opportunity to buy Black designers, buy from Black brands, all of that, and to preserve those things, and so that we can say, we were here during this time and this is what we're doing.
And I just want to comment. So I write the Who's Who in Fashion series, and I remember my publishing company was like, "Well, Carly didn't make it." I was like, "Well, Carly was around for 13 years and she made an impact. So Carly is staying. Carly and Alex are staying in the book." And so that there's an understanding that just because someone didn't make it, if they've been there for 15, 20 years, I'm sorry, they're going to be in my book so that you can understand the impact that they made while they were here.
I do want to ask one more question. We did get one more, but I feel like this is a great note to end on. What moment throughout your career did you feel the most empowered in the different types of work that you were engaging in?
I've been privileged to feel empowered at many points along the timeline, but if I were to choose one, I definitely have to give a shout out to the Will to Adorn initiative, which is part of the Smithsonian, not a part National Museum of African American History and Culture. It actually predates the museum, but the Will to Adorn was headed by Chief Investigator Dr. Diana Njai, and she was actually on my dissertation committee as well. But in short, it was what it was named, right? So it was cataloging the many ways that people of African descent around the world are choosing to read and write themselves through adornment. And it had multiple arms. I worked on the community engagement arm and had young people in Detroit develop their own curriculum around that topic. But we were part of the annual Folklife Festival on the Mall. There were multiple galleries and exhibits around the country dedicated to this work, and it still continues. And so I felt very empowered being a part of a team that was very diverse, right? And diverse in age as well. So we had young people all the way to elders that were part of this work. And so I felt very empowered seeing myself on the team and seeing myself in the work.
I'll add briefly too. For me, the moment that sticks out is at my exhibition opening and having Black women come up to me and say, wow, like I feel great. I feel seen. I feel heard. I've never experienced this before. So just being a part of creating that space where we could see ourselves, that was definitely empowering for me.
My empowering moment or moments is like every time I get the opportunity to interview someone whose, history hasn't been documented yet. So they may have been working in the industry for decades. I'm talking 20, 30, 40, sometimes 50 years, but no one has heard their name. And so having them say to me, I am glad to finally be able to tell my story and tell it my way, and that people know who I am, has been empowering for me.
So the most empowering moment for me is I've been teaching for 22 years. And when you're in that classroom and you're giving, I teach 21st century fashion, and when you're in the classroom and you're giving that educational experience that someone didn't know existed, that cultural perspective that they didn't realize was happening within the industry, it is very empowering. When they want to stay after class and talk to you and try to understand like what's going on, what happened, it's teaching is just very empowering. I didn't even want to go into teaching at first. I had my own business. I was doing well. Somebody convinced me to teach, and I didn't realize how empowering it was, particularly for young Black females. And so to me, that that was probably like the first time I realized that I made an impact is extremely empowering.
I thank you all for sharing those moments with us. That was our last audience question. So I don't believe you all know how truly appreciative I am to have had this conversation with you all this evening. And I thank you so much for agreeing to be on the panel. And I thank all of our audience members for joining us in this very needed conversation. I've learned so much, and I hope you all have been able to learn as well.
Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you, Christian, for moderating. This was such an extraordinary discussion, and I am so grateful for it. Special thanks to the organizers who collaborated on this panel, including our amazing moderator, Christian Hogans. Thank you so much. CSA VP of Tech and host of the Conversations on Dress Diversity track, Dr. Monica Sklar, Costume Society of America board member Graham Wetzbarger, who runs all of our virtual content, CSA VP External Adam McFarland, the CSA office with Kate Ahn, and Kristen Miller-Zone, who is the executive director of CSA. Please follow the Costume Society of America on Facebook and Instagram to make sure you hear about all the upcoming episodes of Conversations on Dress, and consider donating on CSA's website to the organization to support this and other programming. Thank you and have a great night.